All right, it's noon, so we're going to get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome for our third Barn of Tomorrow installment. We're going to be talking about some cattle housing options today. We have two great speakers. The first is going to be Rick Stowell from Nebraska, and he's going to kick us off. So he's worked at Nebraska for a few years now, done a lot of great work on cattle facilities, a great expert, and we're pleased to have him help share some of his knowledge on cattle facility opportunities and options. And then after that, we'll have Kris Kohl, extension engineer up in Northwest Iowa, talk to us about some of the cattle comfort opportunities and options we have to make these facilities a little bit more engaging. With that, thanks everyone for joining us, and thanks Rick for leading the discussion for us today.
Thank you, Dan. And I'll go ahead and get started here with just a brief intro on how we're going to work this. So I'm going to lead off with some higher level perspectives and design considerations. And then Kris is going to work more into the details of design and management in operations. So quick outline of what I'm going to cover. Give a quick overview of some of the driving forces behind facility trends, and major trend is that people are looking at buildings. So I'm going to lead into some pros and cons of buildings. Then we'll briefly highlight facility types. I'm going to spend most of my time talking about how the facility needs to meet primary needs of the animals, and then I'll wrap up with just a few comments on structural considerations. So in terms of big picture, as I look at feedlots, feeding facilities, there's a lot of M's and E's in terms on people's mind. And so those include mud management, manure quality, methane, extreme heat, and expansion. And what I've found over a number of years is that any one of these by itself probably doesn't justify investment in a building, but you put a couple of these together and now you can start getting close to or justifying that investment. I also note that typically one of these six on the screen is usually a tipping point for that decision. So I'm just going to briefly highlight some things. I'm from Nebraska, and compared to Iowa, most of Iowa, we tend to be drier, and so we should be able to have dry lots. But even our folks out in the panhandle are finding that you get several inches of rain in a storm, and the dry lot is now a wet lot, and things go south kind of in a hurry for a while. And we do know that cattle performance is greatly affected by mud, and both in terms of rate of gain and efficiency. So that research has been around for a while, and it's only becoming more established. One of the things we've been doing, have done here in Nebraska and South Dakota, is have some focus groups and conversations with people in the feedlot industry. And one of the things we had them do is take a look at different climate scenarios. And by far and away, the most pessimistic, worst case situation that people saw is any movement towards warmer, wetter winters. And so if you look at the little table over there in the picture, pretty much everything is not ideal or not good situation that in that case. And lo and behold, our trend, if you look over the last 10, 15 years, is towards more frequent than typical, warmer and wetter winters. So another area of concern is just day-to-day management. And we know our producers like to be able to do practices on a set procedure and on a set schedule. And that's just a whole lot easier to do if you're driving on concrete or an improved road and cattle are under roof. Most of you on board also familiar with crop production, or at least have raised corn. You know you use a lot of nitrogen. That's very costly these days. And so with a building, we have potential to increase the amount of nitrogen that's retained in the manure 2 or 3 fold. And so a lot of value to that. Plus, we're not in a building, we're not hauling a lot of pen soil with the manure. You probably heard about methane and biogas and climate credits or carbon credits. Um, Bottom line is methane is both a issue, a challenge, and a opportunity. Unfortunately, with the way that traditional beef production occurs in the United States here, we have very little opportunity to leverage the opportunity in terms of renewable natural gas. So if you go to a building, you're at least increasing your ability there. Heard a lot about heat stress and heat events. In this part of the world, Iowa and Nebraska, we're dealing with summer nighttime temperatures that don't seem to be getting as cool as they used to. And we're also seeing cattle being raised to, instead of 1,000 pounds, 1,200 pounds. Now people are raising them 1,500, 16, maybe 1,800 pounds. And those are high heat producing animals. And finally, we've just got a lot of producers are not wanting to handle runoff, contaminated runoff, or the associated uh, issues that go on with that. And so buildings are one way to minimize or avoid those challenges. So I'm going to just wrap up with this part of my discussion and say that I'm not going to go into these things in detail, but I've made available a little comparison list of pros and cons of moving into a cattle building, and I encourage you to look at that if you're interested. So now I'm going to dive into the buildings themselves and focus on the animals and raise the animals in there. So we have two main systems, bedded systems and slatted floor systems. Kris is going to talk about management differences within some bedded systems, and I'll let him do that. We also have different kinds of structures. And so here in Nebraska, we've got several buildings of each type that I'm showing. We have several fabric arch, basically a steel truss with a hoop cover or a fabric cover to it. We also have a lot of gable buildings where the two sides of the roof slope upward to a ridge, which is generally open. So now I really want to spend most of my time talking about the animal needs. So these are the big ones that I and my peers would look at. There are others. I would call those secondary. So if we're providing fresh air, providing good access to water and feed, keeping the resting place reasonably clean and dry, and providing safe spaces for the cattle to stand and walk, we're accomplishing well over 90% of what we need to do for those animals in terms of a facility. So we'll start out with ventilation. We know with cattle barns, plentiful airflow is the key. If you think back of buildings that were used 40, 50 years ago, most of those failed quickly for one reason or another. And a lot of times the main reason they failed is they just don't have the amount of ventilation that today's buildings have or provide. And look on the right-hand side, I show some pictures of north walls from indoors and outdoors. And basically our producers in this area are being told, and the ones who are doing this most successfully, they are not closing up that north wall completely. They're always keeping some of that open. The cattle can handle it as long as we keep the blowing snow and heavy winds off of them right off the resting area. So in terms of siting these facilities, the main thing we want to do is site them so that they will capture the summer breeze. So in the Western Corn Belt areas out here, typically summer winds come from the south, southeast. And so an east-west arrangement is very common. It allows us to capture those summer breezes, southerly breezes most effectively. And so we want that open, if it's monoslope building, high side of that wall, open to the south. It just so happens that this is conveniently also the east-west orientation is also best for maximizing shade for the animals. One thing I will want to note is a lot of people have built a building and been very happy with it, and then they will build a couple more and they'll stack them parallel in arrangement like I'm showing. And what they find is that uh, they're generating obstructions to the new buildings when they do this. So I encourage you, if you're going to be expanding, which most people will do someday, think about how the new buildings will play and whether they're obstructed or obstructing. A little bit more on natural ventilation. So two main parts of this. We need to allow for both wind effect and chimney effect. So wind effect, basically wind causes pressure on one side of the building, and if there's opening, air comes in, goes through the building, but it has to have a way out. So on the opposite side, there has to be an opening. In the summertime, we rely on this extensively. So these openings, inlet and outlet, have to be there. Chimney effect, we're allowing, when there is no wind or light wind, we're allowing that warm, moist, starting to get contaminated and stale air to naturally rise and escape the building at a higher level, either at the peak or the high side of a tall wall. And when that does that, it creates a little vacuum and naturally draws in fresh air. So I'm just showing a picture of a facility here in Nebraska that we visited 2 summers ago, and we don't have, I've heard of very, very few cattle dying in heat events, but we have had a few. And so my point here is that airflow can be restricted by either design or management. So this is a little older building, but this operator got through many hot summers with the building until the year that his curtain system for raising the curtain was giving him problems. He got busy. Crop season came along, and before he could get to it, a heat wave came across, and in the pens that were in these areas that I'm highlighting, you can see the curtains still down, covering up about half, at least a third to half of that opening. And in those pens, they lost cattle. So it is important to maintain, just because you have the opening to begin with, it has to be managed to be open. Some more things. We want tall walls, and we want as few obstructions in the wall and inside the building as possible. So one of my points here is that concrete's a great structural material, but where it's impermeable to water, it's also impermeable to air. So if we don't need, in the picture at the right, if we don't need those concrete walls there for the dividing walls, if we could do with open gating or rails, that would be a lot better for the cattle, because the wind does not always come perfectly from the south. And if it's coming from the southeast or the west or some other direction, you're going to have dead spots and cattle that are going to be more stressed than they should be. In terms of access to water and feed, most people, I'm not seeing people have problems with water delivery unless it's a manufacturer issue. But there are some issues with feed. The big one is getting 12 inches of bunk space per head. That bunk space in that perimeter of the building is a major cost item. And so we're seeing some people that are either on the one end, they're kind of skimping on that and stocking without that bunk space. And the other end, we're seeing people who, even on narrow to medium width buildings, are putting bunks on both sides. So we're kind of seeing both angles to that. In terms of resting area, two big things. The first thing is have adequate space. And the other one is if you have a bedded system, making sure you're managing that bedding and manure the way it should be. So if you look at a slatted floor barn, I'm not going to go through all these, but commonly we're looking at 23 to 25 square foot per head. What used to work for our 1,200,000 pound animals, 20 square foot per head, isn't working at today's weights. So that's something to think about. And a bed pack barn, we're usually in those low to mid 40s in terms of square foot per head. I'm really seeing that in order to make less than 40 square foot per head work, you have to have somebody who's really using their A game in terms of managing that bed pack. Couple things about the bed pack. We want to keep as much moisture out of that bed pack as we can. So things like elevating waters and preventing spillage from going into the bed pack area is a good idea. Putting in a curb between the scrape alley and the bed pack area. And another thing some people haven't thought about is you have to keep that manure alley, the scrape alley, regularly cleaned. And if you don't have some place to store temporarily that manure in the building, you're probably going to get behind, and that manure is going to end up getting dragged into the bed pack. And you're either going to end up using more bedding than you need to, or you're going to have uncomfortable cows. Just a couple things winding down on in terms of animal needs. We're looking at that standing surface, walking surface. Pretty much everybody's in new construction is going right away with mats, these rubber mats materials. The people who have tried going without them when they built the barn have pretty much all added them since then. So I'd recommend starting right off the bat. For a scrape alley, solid floor, and a bed pack barn, we do want some grooving. Doesn't have to be a diamond groove, but that would, I guess, be the ideal. And then some other things in terms of just safety and walking ease and preventing lameness. So for floors, we want them to dry as quickly as feasible and make sure there's no rough edges or spurs on the concrete. For our gating, it's amazing how often you'll go into a new barn and you'll see 1.5 to 2 inches of threaded bolt sticking out beyond the nut. All those become hazard points, and a lot of latches, cheap latches, become hazard points for both people and cattle. So think about that as buildings going in. I'm going to wind down here my time by just introducing a couple structural considerations. We're mainly thinking about the cattle, but there's some, obviously the barn has to stay up for the cattle to benefit. And question that comes up all the time is steel or wood. From my perspective, I don't consider it a huge issue. They're both greatly affected by moisture and gases in these buildings. So the main thing I want to be concerned about is whether you do wood or steel, you got to ventilate that building, make sure it doesn't wear out and deteriorate before it's time. On wind loads, there are some significant concerns here. You can see some damaged buildings. Monoslope barns are designed to catch the wind. They can also try to catch 60-mile-per-hour wind. So that design has to account for that. And on any of our buildings, when you have a low pitch, we're going to have increased snow load. So I'm going to wrap it up there and just give you my contact information should be on your handout and turn it over to Kris.
Perfect. Thanks, Kris. Thanks, Rick. As Kris starts sharing, we do have a question for you. And the first one is, are you concerned with nose-to-nose contact if you do pipe fences versus concrete walls?
In feeder cattle, I'm not. If this was young stock, I would be a little more concerned, but I'm not seeing any any difference in um, health issues with feeder cattle when they're coming in at several hundred pounds. I think they're beyond that stage where they're uh, and that question is probably better for your veterinarian. But I would say what you're losing in terms of airflow far outweighs that concern, in my opinion.
Perfect. And then one more for you. You mentioned sort of laying out barns and what we should think about. Are there some spacing recommendations to help limit the impact of one barn to the next in terms of how far apart they need to be?
There are, and I guess I would refer most closely to Midwest Plan Service for that. But it's a function of the maximum height of the building or the peak height and the length of the building. So just like a row of trees, the taller the trees grow and the longer the uh, windbreak, uh, the farther apart you're going to have to space it to capture that wind again.
Perfect. Thanks, Rick. If you do have more questions for Rick, feel free to type them in the chat as Kris is presenting, and we won't let Rick off the hook so easily, and we'll come back to some more at the end. With that, your screen looks great, Kris, so go ahead and take it away.
Okay, well, I'm going to talk about the animal comfort. Let's see.
You just accidentally muted yourself there, Kris. Hey, Kris.
There we
Always great.
go.
There we go. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to talk about animal comfort. Um, guess the one we're looking at here is a Holstein steer in a bedded barn. Would you say this animal is comfortable? Um, Probably he looks happy, doesn't have too much manure on his flank, probably going to perform fairly well. Okay, when does a building excel? It excels when I'll say outside weather is not very good, especially if you're bringing in light calves in times when you have rain, cold, windy conditions. Trying to get them started on feed is always difficult. Also, we have a big problem when we have the heavy cattle. It's muddy or it gets really hot and sunny. Um, Now, here in Iowa, we sometimes complain about the heat in the summertime. I do remember in my career one time when we had a week when temperatures exceeded 105 every day with high humidity. That was probably the worst week of my life when many cattle producers lost more cattle in that week than they had in their lifetime. But we do have those extreme events, and with heavy black-hided cattle that we like to grow, that market likes, they are certainly more susceptible in open lots. And we have, of course, dairy steers that people are raising. They tend to be short-haired. They tend to, I'll just say, take confinement a lot better than I'll say some of the other cattle. Normally, when we're looking at these kinds of buildings, I'm going to say we're looking at English breeds. Um, Real popular are Angus Hereford crosses. They seem to do very well in the confined kinds of systems. This is an evaluation out of South Dakota where we have paired lots. Open lot here with 275 square feet per head. Uh, Second set where we have a building with an outside lot, a total of 215, and then a total confinement. If we take a look at the performance of this kind of a system, um, Basically, they all went in at the same weight. If you look down there at their dry matter intake, basically we fed them all the same amount of feed. Their final weight was highest in the shelter, followed very closely by the confinement. Average daily gain, of course, then was better with those heavier finish weights, and also the feed to gain ratio was better with the shelter. Couple of our designs we have, I'll say, on the normally the south side is completely open all of the time. We have two basic types of curtain openings. Either we have a split curtain like this is, where we have a very small curtain near the top. This curtain is closed during blizzards and blizzards only when there's a huge amount of snow coming in to try to prevent some of the excess snow coming into the building. Normally only extends down about 3 feet. And then we have the lower curtain um, that is there, uh, normally about a 16-foot um, sidewall. So this is an 8 to 10 foot curtain, um, rolls up from the bottom. Um, and we do have a lot of our buildings have a concrete wall on the back wall. This is so that you can drive Drover Alley to drive the cattle in and out. Um, Second style, they will leave completely open up at the top, at least a foot opening, and then just have a one-piece curtain that rolls up to the center. Again, both of these styles are going to be open 8 months of the year completely, and then just managed in the dead of winter to provide some extra shelter, especially when we have a very, very strong north wind. Um, and here you can see, even though you see snow in the alleyway, you see that curtains clear up. In just the extreme weather events, they're going to be managed. Um, Goals are always to keep the cattle dry, protect them from the wind if the wind is excessive, and I'd say anything over 25 miles an hour, you've gained all the benefits you need to in terms of the uh, wind chill effect that you can get on the cattle. Um, And we'll talk about the floor types, either the solid or floors that are bedded, and we're at about that 40 square feet per head, and then confinement on slats. Um, have some range. I will say if you go down much below the 40, and at 40 square feet, in our normal water consumption of 10 gallons per head per day, those cattle are urinating a quarter inch per day, which is about what our maximum evaporation is. So we're going to get them getting wet uh, very quickly. Slatted floor, 25 square feet per head. Really can't go very much higher in terms of that. The cattle might do okay. However, the cost per space um, it kind of limits us to about that range that you're looking at. And again, I will say in these tight buildings, especially the total confinement slatted floor, you need to look at the animal type, and that generally speaking, our good English breeds will perform well. But there are certain, I'll say, wilder animals that just will not perform well under heavy confinement. Some issues, talked a little bit about diseases, gases, some of the particulate matter, dust that we might get, lameness. We'll talk a little bit about uh, digital dermatitis or hairy heel wart, um, other diseases, skin burns. Aprons around the pack need to be scraped, I'll say weekly or even bi-weekly. We normally shred corn stalks, and that's added either weekly or bi-weekly. And pens are normally completely cleaned out between groups of cattle. Deep packs versus shallow packs. I when we first started to do these things, a lot of people went with the deep packs. We saw that they were warmer and so forth. So what has evolved is that we oftentimes go with a deep pack during the winter months, and then through the summer, we will go with a shallow uh, pack where we're cleaning it out, maybe completely cleaning it out every 2 weeks to a month, and we're not allowing it to compost and get warmer when we want it to be cooler. Um, Deep pack, you can look through here. You can see that at the same time, our overall average pack temperature was warmer. Um, a lot of the other things were very, very similar across deep versus shallow. I think one of the uh, big aha moments for a lot of our bedded confinement barns is that they need to use just as much bedding during the summer as they do the winter, primarily because the evaporation loss in the summer is less and cattle tend to drink more and produce more urine during that time. As far as rubber mats versus concrete floors, if we take a look at this, uh, I mean, really a high morbidity rate. And with our cattle buyers, if a calf has a hard time keeping up with the rest of his group, at least at our some of our packs, they will tank that animal. I mean, at the prices that they are now, that's a big loss. Um, as as has been said, most people with concrete slats have gone to the rubber mats, and I would recommend that straight out of the gate, primarily because of this issue with the feet and legs and the cattle performing better and more of them getting sold. Digital dermatitis or hairy heel wart. These are just, I'll just say, some symptoms that we have. In general, we've seen this a lot with coming from Holsteins in dairy barns, and maybe those animals that we are finishing that are dairy crosses tend to have more problems with it. Um, and animals coming from locations where they were under manure and wet conditions. And it seems as though mixing the cattle as well as the stress induced with um, moving, maybe working the cattle seems to bring it on. And unfortunately, this is a time issue. It seems to get the animals as they're very close to market. Most people will put them into a separate recovery pen and don't see quite as much, but it is certainly an emerging issue. Kind of lastly, kind of looking here at some of the things with our barns, it is important that if you're on a schedule and that you say are bedding them once a week, that you don't even go a day or two longer. It tends to cause the manure that's in there to start to stick to the hides. Um, And we have seen these kinds of, we'll call them manure burns on the flank of the animal. Um, I'll just say buyers, when they're looking at them, if they've got a lot of matted manure on them, probably can't take the heat and cold stress as a calf with a good hair coat, lower gains, dressing percentage. That's just by the weight of the manure that's hanging on there. Also, the packers looking at the value of that hide, probably worth about $30 if they have to trim off a lot of it. Probably might even be tanked. And then there's always this potential for E. coli, and it's a lot harder, I think, to get those animals skinned without any contamination that are carrying a lot of manure on them. And of course, that's the worst nightmare for a packing house is to have some kind of recall because of an E. coli scare, and they always go well beyond the animal that it happened to. Kind of a close up, Midwest Plant Service has a nice publication on building types and managing these things that can be picked up from any extension office across the Midwest. And there's my contact information.
Perfect. Thanks, Kris. We have another question. I'm going to look to Rick to answer this one. He didn't get to tell us about the Feedlot Innovation Center they've been working on over in Nebraska, but Will asked a question about any health differences between deep pits versus a scraper or a shallow pit for beef, and then says, I've heard of deep pits having relatively more issues with hydrogen sulfide in cattle than he has experienced with pigs. And I'd be interested to hear, Rick, sort of what you all were thinking about in terms of some of the gas issues when you were thinking about your innovation feedlot center?
Well, it was a consideration, but I'm not aware of any modern shallow pit beef buildings, and we only have deep pit barns at our new Klosterman Feedlot Innovation Center. And I did put a couple slides in there. Hopefully you can take a look at that. But we do know, for example, that in the hog industry, uh, they use shallow pit. They prefer shallow pit buildings for their young animals, nursery and farrowing buildings, because air quality is an issue and it's a factor in disease, especially for those younger animals. And so, again, since we're talking feeder cattle, generally being put in these barns on slatted floors, and we're not putting. We have several cow calf barns in Nebraska. Those are all bedded systems. So they're not going on a slatted floor. If they were, I would expect that they would be shallow pit.
Mhm. And I think we have a few deep pit barns where they have digesters where they operate like a shallow pit in Iowa, built sort of deep for convenience of working on the system underneath it, but operated like a shallow pit. And from a manure perspective, I think one of the things that we see maybe with the deep pit barn is there's a bigger opportunity to get a good crust on that manure. And then the commercial applicator or the person agitating the barn feels the need to really break up that crust, and you feel like the beef barn's open, but a lot of surface agitation still releases hydrogen sulfide very rapidly. And especially if the wind betrays you in the evening, as it gets calm oftentimes in Iowa, we have some issues with hydrogen sulfide in deep pit barns. I don't know that that changes a whole lot with shallow
Yeah.
pit barns, other than you get rid of some of the agitation concern.
Well, on my list of pros and cons, one of the things I mentioned is that odor becomes much more of a relevant issue consideration if you go to a deep pit building. And it's because just like hogs, when we store that manure, and now we're anaerobic activity going in there, it's going to produce gases like hydrogen sulfide. And then, so you get into a lot of the similar issues
Mhm.
of that deep pit beef barn, when you go to handle the manure, and if you close the building up, is going to function very much like a deep pit hog barn.
Perfect. And then Justin asked the perfect follow-up question really to this, and he's asking, is there any new quantitative data on gas emissions from the barns or studies planned to collect emission data from different styles of barns?
Well, the main study that was done was I think Beth Doran is on, and there's a group from South Dakota, Iowa, Minnesota, and Nebraska that collaborated and did some studies about 10 years ago. And there has been not a lot done since then. We are planning to do some, but funding is really hard to come by these days, and especially funding on things like odor and gas emissions. Um, so it might be a while before we get that data, but we are looking to update some of that data.
Beautiful. And that was really one of the Feedlot Innovation Center's opportunities with its design to have the same cattle on different styles of housing side by side to really generate some of that data. Is that right?
Yeah, and another illustration of manure. I know you're the manure guy, so you're bringing up manure questions, but from a manure angle, one of the things I fought very hard for was making sure we had at least three separate pits in those deep pit barns. So each of the deep pit buildings ideally would have had nine pits because there's nine pens. But at least this way we can compare some manure additives, some emissions were from the different pits and
Mhm.
things like that.
Awesome. And then my next question is for Kris Kohl. I just had a question about twine management in some of those bedded packs. Any concerns, any recommendations there?
Well, if they use a bale shredder, as that winds through the thing, all of the twine or the net wrapping ends up on the edge of the machine, all wrapped up in there. And in fact, I was shocked at how much it is. It's about when they've done 1,000 head barn, there's about a foot of net wrap that's all plastic wrapped around the axle of that uh, shredder. And the farmer that I have dealt with a lot, he had a special heat gun that he could cut that all off and wind it off, and it was probably a 10 or 15 minute process. But all those kinds of things are issues when you bed them, and we have seen cattle will eat that material. It is important when you are bedding the cattle that you bed them two to 3 hours after you have fed them so that they're filled up with a good feed. Otherwise, when you do bed them, I don't know if they're playing with it or they like it, but they will eat the straw or the corn stalks that don't have very many calories in them, and you can have performance issues because of them consuming the bedding rather than the feed and the bunk. So very important in how you manage that and timing. And yes, it is an issue, and you should remove it if possible.
Perfect. And then Patrick asked, what sort of pounds of nitrogen per thousand gallons of manure might you expect in deep pit beef barns, and what sort of range do you see?
Are you asking me?
Well, yeah, go right ahead.
Okay. My experience has been about 45 to 50 pounds, maybe even moving up to 60 pounds per thousand. Normally superior to swine barns, and especially in the phosphorus category. So they're normally about 25 to 30% higher nutrient content on beef barns compared to swine barns.
Perfect. And then as long as we had the hydrogen sulfide question, any recommendations on agitation tips or strategies, design of the barn to make agitation a little bit easier, or anything you've seen in that realm?
Well, on my side, I mean, one of the big, oftentimes the barns are going to be pumped possibly earlier than swine barns. If the wind is not 15 miles an hour, you should not be doing any of this rooster tailing that's out there. And I just talked this morning with an individual, and he has a monitor that he wears all the time. And we were talking about it. The only time that monitor has gone off is when he was agitating a beef barn. And fortunately, with that one, they removed all of the cattle from the facility while they were uh, agitating and pumping. And I'll just say, over the years, I know of individuals that have lost, as many as 9 or 10 in a pen while they were pumping and agitating. And so it's definitely a concern.
Perfect. Yep, go
If
ahead,
you don't,
Rick.
if you don't mind chiming in a little different angle, I totally agree with what Kris said. In terms of manure and agitation and deep pit barns, one thing we're finding is that producers who were originally following recommendations to divert water, clean water away from the barn or the pit, those with deep pits, generally speaking, are looking to be able to capture that. So just visited half a dozen operations about a month ago, and had all rearranged their systems so that they could collect rainwater and divert it to the pit. Obviously, you have to have room in the pit to handle that, but they were doing it because it makes the agitation far easier.
Absolutely. We see the same thing. We're a little bit wetter than you, so my general is every other downspout goes into the pit. But yeah, some water definitely is often helpful in that regard. And then I think one of the big differences that struck me when I first started with some deep pit cattle barns is they don't build pump outs like they do for swine manure. And that just makes things a little bit more challenging. And that's because stuff's in the way, right? It's just hard to have a pump out on that barn. Any great ideas that you've seen people do from that? Just move gates around and push cattle back from the slat you have to pull up? Anything beyond that and what anyone's seen?
I,
I
I
haven't.
I have
Go ahead.
seen one barn where they put a pump out port on the end of the barn. And and it's a fairly new one. Now they still pull up slats for the center of the barn, but it does allow them to pump and agitate. It might be something that we see in the future.
Yeah, I concur with that.
Perfect. So I think that takes us to the end of the questions. I'd like to thank both Rick and Kris for sharing their thoughts today on feedlot cattle. Especially appreciate the cooperation with Nebraska, where you tend to have a little more cattle industry than us. So it's always great to get some expertise over here. And thanks again, everyone, for joining us. If you do have questions, feel free to email either Rick or Kris, and I'm sure they will address them. Otherwise, thank you for joining us today. And next week, I believe we have Tony Mensing and Kris Clark will be sharing on some camera systems, maybe for especially related to calving barns.